My beach, don't you know that when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, there was still Sahabas reciting abrogated verses that were not part of the Quran? Until later on there was ijma' that is not part of the Quran. So here's the question, were the Sahabas that were reciting the abrogated verses that are not in the Quran today, after the death of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, were they kuffar because they were adding to the Quran? Because it's not part of the Quran anymore. So you expose my beach. Until later on there was ijma' that is not part of the Quran. So here's the question, where the...
Yeah, so I'm going to answer this question just because I don't want other people to get confused by this kind of silly argument. But you can find out more about the Quran and what there really is ijma' about in this book, because this is a book about what is known from Islam by necessity, and it's focused on a compilation of things which are agreed upon among all schools of thought. Now, this video, I don't know if this person is serious or just a joker or a troll or whatever, but I have to correct very false statements about the Quran because it could spread misinformation. So he gave the impression that Sahaba who recited verses of the Quran that he claims, first of all, that claims that they were abrogated, and then he claimed that they were no longer part of the Quran, and he claimed that there was ijma' that they were no longer part of the Quran. This is false. There's no such ijma', there's no such issue at all. So when we talk about the ijma' of the Sahaba on the Mus'haf of Uthman, there's ijma' that this is Quran. That doesn't mean that the other ahruf, the other dialects that were recited in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, doesn't mean that they are not also Quran. But Uthman, he established a system where he preserved as much of the different dialects as he could within the 4 or 5 manuscripts that he sent out, and the official reciters that he appointed to teach, and many of them were preserved. And there was ijma' and full authentication on different layers of authentication, both on the text and the script, with witnesses and memorization for everything within that. And there's ijma' that is Quran. That doesn't mean that the other recitations of ahruf in the different dialects, that they were not Quran, or that they were no longer Quran. There's no such thing like this. There's also the issue of abrogated verses. Now, abrogation is different types. There is the abrogation where the wording remains in the Quran, but the hukum changes. And there is abrogation where the wording is replaced, but the hukum remains, or even where both the wording and the hukum are both replaced. Now, nobody from the Sahaba can continue to recite as Quran verses where the wording has been replaced. This does not exist. I think you got this thing mixed up. Perhaps you've been listening to Orientalists and Christian missionaries and actually being fooled by some of the false arguments too easily, and you start to take it on yourself. Now, I don't know if you are actually yourself not Muslim and that's why you're making these sort of insulting comments, or if you're just a very confused Muslim. But just take it easy, learn a bit more about your deen first, and then inshallah discuss.
So guys, the fool Abu Baraa, what the Khawarij call as their teacher, Ya Habibi, this guy was not understanding what I was saying. Habibi, I'm not talking about different qira'at, I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about the verse of 5 sucklings. The verse of 5 suckling, first of all, the verses of when the Quran was sent, it was 10 sucklings. Then Allah made it 5 sucklings. Then the verse of 5 sucklings was removed from the Quran in its recitation, but its ruling was not abrogated. Okay, this Imam al-Nawawi حبيبي ترد على الإمام النووي. Look, this is شرح النووي على Muslim. Okay, page 23. Okay, volume 10. This guy is like going on. He didn't bring any conclusion, no dalil, nothing. Okay, look guys, look what I'm gonna do. Look what I'm gonna do. وقولها أي عائشة. This is شرح في إمام النووي. Okay, فتوفي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وهن فيما يقرأ. As for the verses of, because talking about the verses of suckling. Okay, verses of suckling. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, and the people were still reciting it as part of Quran, not being aware of it being abrogated. هو بضم الياء في يقرأ. Okay, يقرأ. ومعناه أن النسخ ب5 رضعات تأخر إنزاله جدا حتى إنه صلى الله عليه وسلم توفي وبعض الناس يقرأ 5 رضعات ويجعلها قرآنا متلو لكونه لم يبلغه النسخ لقرب عهده، فلما بلغهم النسخ بعد ذلك رجعوا عن ذلك وأجمعوا على أن هذا لا يتلى يصادى. So the Prophet Muhammad died, okay? The verse of 5 sucklings was recited from the Quran. Remember guys, abrogation is different, but this abrogation, the abrogation was of recitation, not the hukum. So the hukum of 5 sucklings is still till this day, okay? But the recitation that was found in the Quran, the verse of the 5 sucklings that was found in the Quran is abrogated, is no longer in the Quran. But when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, the people were still reciting the abrogated verse of the 5 sucklings, because the abrogation came so late that that when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, not all the Sahaba knew that it was abrogated from the Quran, okay? And most of them were reading the 5 sucklings verse and making it وَيَجْعَلُهَا قُرْآنًا as part of the Quran, matlu, recited, لِكَوْنِهِ لَمْ يَبْلُغْهُ النَّسْ, because some of the Sahaba did not know Prophet Muhammad ﷺ abrogated this verse, or that it was abrogated. لِقُرْبِ عَهْدِهِ, because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died very soon. This verse was revealed like at the last event of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's life. فَلَمَّا بَلَغْهُمْ نَسْخ, but when it came so that they know that these verses were abrogated, بعد ذلك رجعوا عن ذلك, they word off, they did not make it part of the Quran anymore. They stopped reciting the verse of 5 sucklings and they did not make it part of the Quran. وَأَجْمَعُوا عَلَى أَنَّ هَذَا لَا يُتْلَى, and they made ijma', consensus, that the verse of 5 sucklings is not recited anymore, is not part of the Quran in recitation. So Abu Bakr, were they kuffar because they were adding to the Quran? Because it's not part of the Quran.
Okay, now I understand what you're talking about. Now it's just even more weird. So you're talking about when some Sahaba were still reciting abrogated verses until they found out they were abrogated, and so then they corrected it and recited the Quran as agreed. That is not called adding to the Quran. I don't know what you're talking about. No, the Sahaba never added anything to the Quran. The verses that were abrogated, that were recited, it was Quran until Allah abrogated the wording and completed the final order of the Quran and or the order of all the verses. And then the Sahaba corrected themselves and recited the Quran as it was completed. So to accuse the Sahaba of adding to the Quran, and I'm obviously in the middle of some other argument or debate you've got with somebody else, and putting aside all the bad language and things like this, but be careful with the language. The Sahaba did not add anything to the Quran just because they were reciting the verses of the Quran that were taught to them by the Prophet ﷺ until they were abrogated, until they were informed about its abrogation, and so then they recited the completed order of the Quran. Simple.
Okay, as you guys can see, the fool Abu Baraa, he now confessed that I was correct. Okay, why do you accuse me of saying something which I didn't say, bro? Now the thing is, I didn't accuse the Sahaba of kufr. The thing is, ya Habibi, there was this guy, if you can go back to my videos, instead of accusing me of wrong things, there was this guy, he's saying that there was no ijma' of Ahlul Sunnah. He said that some of the Sahaba fought against Al-Hajjaj, the Muslim leader, okay? I told this guy that if they fought against him, this was before the ijma' was made. قبل أن ينعقد الإجماع, that is not permissible to fight the rulers. Because remember, we had two parties. Some Sahaba viewed at that time that it's not permissible to fight against the ruler, while others actually went against the rulers and fought against them, right? Because ijma' at that time was not made. But then ijma' was made later on, so now everyone has to go to the ijma', right? So I told this guy, look at it this way. So if you're claiming that the Sahaba did this, the Sahaba that did khuruj, were they right? They're not right. Okay, but this was before the ijma' was made. We can say the same thing regarding the 10 sucklings and the 5 sucklings. Okay, the 5 sucklings, they came the verse was abrogated very late till the Prophet died. But some of the Sahaba were still reciting as part of Quran. I'm asking this guy, were those Sahaba who were reciting this as part of the Quran because the news did not reach them, were they correct? No, because the it did not reach them that this was no longer part of the Quran. But then when it was reached them, they formed the ijma'. When the ijma' was made that this is part of the Quran, this is not part of the Quran anymore, no one is allowed to go against the ijma'. Because as if anyone goes against the ijma' while knowing that there's ijma', خلاص, يعني because Sahaba ajma' عليها, then he becomes a kafir, right? So I was telling this guy, if the Sahaba, are you accusing the Sahaba if they committed a mistake by doing khuruj, some of them, by doing khuruj, are you claiming that they were right because some of the Sahaba were wrong? They didn't, during the time of, because the news of abrogation did not come to them regarding some of the verses of the Quran, they still recited after the Prophet died and made it part of the Quran. But they were not aware of it. So same thing we can say about the Sahaba. So this is what I'm trying to say to this guy. If he wants to prove that the Sahaba did what they did is right, then I can tell him, okay, why are you when the Sahaba were reciting this as part of the Quran when it was not anymore, were they right in this? If he says they're right, then he's clearly accusing the Sahaba of kufr, right? So he's saying that the Sahaba are kuffar. So you do not understand what I was saying. And if you want to do mubahala on this, we can do, wallahi. And I have no... No. Yeah, Abu Baraa, listen, bro. Don't be running around, bro, like a fool. Okay? What I said is the abrogated verses that were removed from the Quran. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, and these abrogated verses were still recited. The Prophet said they were abrogated, and some Sahaba heard it, others did not hear it. The group of the Sahaba that heard from the Prophet that it was abrogated, they said it's not part of Quran anymore. The Sahaba who did not hear the Prophet say it, although it was already abrogated, they still recited it from the Quran, made it part of the Quran. So now you have two groups, Sahaba saying that it's not part of the Quran, it's abrogated, and another saying it's part of the Quran because they still recited it. So you're trying to say that this verse is part of the Quran, okay? So are you saying that if we add this verse today, this abrogated verse today, part of the Quran, and you still recite it, is this not kufr? Because it's adding to the Quran still. Remember, Habibi, if we add the verses that were removed from the Quran, right? The verses that were removed from the Quran. The verses that are removed from the Quran through abrogation by recitation, but not hukam. Let's say we put these verses back in the Quran today. Would that not be tahrif? It would. Why? Because no more recitation of the Quran. It's no longer found in the Quran. So that's what I'm trying to say, right? This would be claiming that the Sahaba committed kufr. Because, listen bro, some Sahaba heard that khuruj is haram. Other group heard that they viewed it as not haram because they didn't hear that. Then later on, ijma' was formed that khuruj is haram. Because there's all the hadith say that, right? Against a Muslim, khuruj is haram. So now today, no one can go against the ijma' and say khuruj is not haram because already ijma'. Similarly with the verse that the Sahaba, when there was a group of Sahaba reciting this verse, abrogated verse of the Quran. Why? Because it never reached them that the Prophet said it's not part of the Quran. Same thing with the khuruj. Some Sahaba, it reached them that khuruj is haram. Some other Sahabas did khuruj because it did not reach them that khuruj was haram. Later on in the centuries, when the hadiths were compiled, such as Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, we have it, everything, the knowledge in front of us. It has become clear to us that we cannot go against it. Because there's ijma' of Ahl Sunnah that khuruj is haram. Similarly with the Quran thing. The verses that were abrogated, there were still people reciting it after the Prophet died. So after its abrogation. So would we say that they're adding things to the Quran? No, because it did not reach them. So similarly with the Sahaba that were doing khuruj. The consensus did not reach, the hadith did not reach them of Prophet Muhammad forbidding that. While another group, it reached them that it was forbidden. So this is what the thing you didn't understand me about, because if you're clearly saying that these verses are part of the Quran, then can we add them in the Quran today? The abrogated verses? The verses that you're talking about, the 5 cycling, can we add it to the Quran today? Would it be considered kufr if a person adds it to the Quran today? Of course, because it's adding and subtracting the Quran. So this exposes you completely. Ya Abu Iyad, why are you accusing me of something you do not see? The guy who tagged you, he didn't show you the full picture. Look what I have asked him. Look through my video here. Look what I have said. My beach, don't you know that when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, there were still Sahabas reciting abrogated verses that were not part of the Quran? Until later on there was ijma' that is not part of the Quran. So here's the question, what are the Sahabas that were reciting the abrogated verses that are not in the Quran today, after the death of Prophet Muhammad, were they kuffar because they were adding to the Quran? Because it's not part of the Quran anymore. They were exposed my be. So here's the thing, I asked him, here's the question, were they kuffar? I never accused the Sahaba of kufr, Baraa, don't say this. I'm asking him a question, because he asked me a question, the Sahaba and scholars rebelled against Hajjaj. Yes, this was during Hajjaj time, before Ijma' was formed. Because there was a group of Sahaba that viewed that revolting is haram, and other group of Sahaba viewed that revolting was not haram. Because the Adillah did not reach them. Okay, like during the Sahaba, for example, they didn't have the compilation of Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. Each Sahabi was with the Prophet in different events. He heard some things which another Sahabi who wasn't with the Prophet at that event, he didn't hear that. Right? He didn't hear that from him. So, this is what I mean. I never said that they were doing that. But I was saying to him, the question, that would it be considered the Sahabas who after the Prophet Muhammad died, since Ijma' was not yet formed, right? Would it be considered that since the Prophet Muhammad died and this verse was already abrogated, these people who didn't hear the Prophet say that these verses are abrogated, and they were still reciting the Quran, would that be considered of them adding to the Quran? Because according to this guy right here, he claims that yeah, because if the Sahabas revolt against Hajjaj, then that means they're right in that. So then we can say, okay, so the Sahaba that were reciting the abrogated verses after the death of the Prophet, since it did not reach them, the news of the Prophet, they were right as well. So they were adding to the Quran, according to him, so they're adding to the Quran. And this is what you misunderstood from. That if they fought against him, this was before the Ijma' was made. قبل أن ينعقد الإجماع.
Okay, so now this has turned into an interesting discussion, I could say. So just to summarize quickly, your point is that some of the Sahaba, when they engaged in rebellion, I'm not going to call it rebellion, I don't say that it is baghi, nor do I necessarily call it khuruj, but rising up against a ruler for whatever reason, because they distinguish that between baghi, and all of the Sahaba agreed in this matter of clear-cut evidence that baghi is haram, but what they were doing, they did not believe was baghi. So whether or not they were correct or not, it's clear that they had this opinion that in certain circumstances, if they believed that they could remove the impression and bring justice, etc., they believed that in their ijtihad that they were doing the right thing. And you're suggesting that basically they did this at that time, but they were wrong, and that this was before an ijma' was established among the Sahaba that rising against the ruler in any circumstances is prohibited, according to what you're saying. And so then they changed, is what you're suggesting. And you gave the example that those Sahaba that were reciting the verses of the Quran about the suckling, which was abrogated, but they didn't know that it was abrogated. When they found out that it was abrogated, then they corrected it. So then you're saying that this is analogous. Okay, right. So the first of all, these are not analogous. These are not two like matters at all questions. I'll come to the issue about the ijma' in a second, but the case of the abrogation had nothing to do with ijma'. The Quran did not become abrogated because of ijma'. The Quran is only abrogated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through revelation by Jibreel direct to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who taught the Prophet how to order the Quran and which verses go where, and he revised the final Quran twice with him in Ramadan in the last year of his life sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so it's by direct sunnah nabawiyya or wahi nabawi, the revelation by the Prophet or via the Prophet ﷺ in his sunnah, that the Sahaba were informed about the abrogation. It was not by ijma'. The Sahaba could never come to a point of ijma' changing the Quran by themselves or their agreement unless it was directly from the Prophet ﷺ. Ijma' is a proof of the sunnah, you could say this, or revealing a hidden evidence that did not reach us, you could say that, but it is not the case that the Sahaba decided. It's not the case. And the Sahaba, the way they compiled the Quran and the way they had the Mus'haf of Uthman ordering the Quran in the final version was through witnesses, testimony directly from the Prophet ﷺ. They had two witnesses for every single verse except for one. as we know, for which there was one witness, as well as many other huffaz who had already memorized the Quran, complete and correct. So the issue of the abrogation has nothing to do with ijma. Yes, there's ijma about what is the Quran and the final order of the Quran. There is ijma about it, but it's not the fact that those Sahaba accepted it after an ijma. They accepted it after they were informed that the Prophet ﷺ had explained the final order of the Quran and these verses were abrogated. That's and because it was at the end of his life, they hadn't yet heard it until after he had passed away. But they passed on the message via the Sunnah, the same way that we read any other hadith. So that's one point. So this has got nothing to do with this idea of ijma. The second thing is, if you understand what ijma is, you would understand that it is impossible for what you're suggesting to be true, because ijma is refuted by the kibar of the Sahaba. So when you had kibar of the Sahaba, like Aisha radiallahu anha, or Muawiyah you could say is not necessarily among the kibar of the Sahaba, but certainly among the others from Muhajirin and the Ansar, they refute any so-called ijma. So if they differ with the ijma, then there's no ijma. Ijma means a consensus of the Sahaba. It's not something where the Sahaba one day turn around and decide, we're going to make this decision and that's it, now that's a revelation. The Sahaba will never be dalil shara'i, wahi. When they all agree upon something which appears to somebody to contradict the Quran and Sunnah, that is a proof, that is called ijma, and it is a proof that they did not contradict the Quran and Sunnah, but they must have an evidence for what they agreed upon that did not reach us by another route, because the Prophet testified that the Sahaba will never gather and agree upon misguidance, and Allah has testified to their understanding collectively as a group as well, even as an individual as well. So that is not, it's not the case that you're thinking. The second thing is, the burden of proof is upon you to prove that there is an ijma about the topic of rising against a ruler. Now, it is agreed upon that baghi, rebellion, unjust rebellion, is clearly prohibited. That is different from khawarij, because the khawarij are a specific sect, and they're there described and understood by their aqidah, which is also ijma, that it is misguidance and batil. Not necessarily kufr, but misguidance. But baghi is not the same as the khawarij. It's not the khuruj by the meaning of khawarij, and that's not really where the word khawarij comes from anyway. But baghi is prohibited, yes. The other question of whether it's allowed to rise to replace a ruler in some circumstances, there is a general agreement that in certain circumstances, if there's kufr bawah, for example, then this is this is compulsory to rise, and this is mentioned by many ulama in Sharh Sahih Muslim, Qadi Iyad, Imam Nawawi, based upon the hadith Nabawi from the Prophet hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, narrated by Ubadah ibn Samit. There's evidence for that. Other cases where it's less than kufr, this is not agreed upon in the same way at all, but there were certainly opinions, and rising up against dhulm was known to be the way of the Salaf. To claim that there was ijma' al-Sahaba, that is a very big thing, and you need to bring proof for that.
Abu Bara, you're beating around the bush right now, okay? We just showed you sharh of Imam Nawawi and with the page number and the juz', okay? I never said that the Sahaba decided it. I said that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he gave the Quran. The Sahabas who heard from him that this verse was abrogated, they did not include it anymore in the Quran because the Prophet said so. And the Quran came down correct as the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ brought it. These Sahabas who were present, they knew it. The Sahabas who were not present, they thought these abrogated verses were part of the Quran. Later on, when they were informed, then they made an ijma', then they knew that it is not part of the Quran anymore. As you can see here, look what Sahih Muslim says. You're beating around the bush, Habibi. Look, it says, فَلَمَّا بَلَغَهُمُ النَّسْخ بَعْدَ ذَلك رَجَعُوا عَنْ ذَلك. When the Sahaba who did not know that it was abrogated, that these verses were abrogated, they went, when it came to them that it is abrogated, when the news reached them that it was abrogated, these verses were abrogated, they stopped reciting it as part of the Quran. وأجمعوا, and there's إجماع على أن هذا لا يتلى. They all the Sahaba made consensus that this verse is not to be recited from the Quran. Why? Because these Sahabas were not informed that it was abrogated. But the other Sahabas were informed that it's abrogated. So when they were informed, afterwards what happened? They made a consensus, formed a consensus, all of them, that this verse is not part of the Quran anymore. So yeah, I don't know what you're talking about beating around the bush. Yani, it's clear. Okay? Yani Abu Baraa, I showed you all the videos, all the evidence. And it seems like you're beating around the bush. يعني هذا ما نقله النووي. This is the same thing as the Nawawi says. فلما بلغهم النسخ بعد ذلك رجعوا عن ذلك وأجمعوا على أن هذا لا يتلى. What didn't you understand? Okay? For they might not, when they were informed afterwards, they stopped reciting it and formed a consensus that this verse should not be recited anymore. خلاص, you're done. Yeah, إخوة, there are some things that to keep in mind in Sahih al-Bukhari. Near Ibn Abbas, I heard Allah's Apostle saying, if the son of Adam had money equal to a valley, then he will wish for nothing similar to it, for nothing can satisfy the eye of Adam's son except dust, and Allah forgives him who repents to him. Ibn Abbas said, I do not know whether this saying was quoted from the Quran or not. So Ibn Abbas, the Sahabi, is saying that he doesn't know if this was quoted as part of the Quran or not. So some of the Sahaba, it didn't reach them that this was actually a verse in the Quran, and it was abrogated in recitation, and it is now a hadith. Its hukum remains as a hadith. But Ibn Abbas says, I do not know. So regarding when Ibn Abbas said, I do not know whether is this from the Quran or not, was he saying, I don't know, maybe this is missing from the Quran, or this is part of the Quran? So would that be considered kufr? No. Because after the Sahaba have made ijma', then the Quran has been, it's preserved. When the Sahaba made ijma', Ibn Abbas agreed to it, that this is no longer part of the Quran. So, but what I'm saying is, before the ijma', there was still some people saying, I don't know if it's part of the Quran or if it was abrogated. Some of the Sahaba were saying that. But then when ijma' was formed, what is abrogated, all the Sahaba know what is abrogated and what is not abrogated. That's when ijma' was made. But before ijma' they were excused because the Quran was still being compiled. So any of my BTs, the Kharijis, who are saying that there is no ijma' of Ahlul Sunnah, that it is not permissible to fight the Sultan, the ijma' came way after the Sahaba. Dalil, the book Sharh al-Nawawi ala Muslim, Imam al-Nawawi, okay, Sharh, page 539 of his book, Juz' 12, okay, 12. We look at the Sharh of Imam al-Nawawi. What does he say? What does he say here? I want you to look here, ya ikhwa, okay? I want to look here. Okay? Imam Nawawi says, وَأَمَّا الْخُرُوجُ عَلَيْهِمْ وَقِتَالُهُمْ فَحَرَامٌ بِإِجْمَاعِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. It's haram. As for revolting against the leaders and fighting them, it is haram, forbidden, according to the consensus of all Muslims. وَإِن كَانُوا فَسَقَةً ظَالِمِينَ. Even if they were evildoers, fasiqs, and ظالمين, wrongdoers or oppressive. Now remember, fasiq, being a fasiq, is not according to Sharia of Allah. And committing dhulm, oppression, is not according to Sharia of Allah. It's a sin. But either way, there is ijma', you're not supposed to fight against them. Okay. وقد تظاهرت الأحاديث بمعنى ما ذكرته وأجمع أهل السنة أنه لا ينعزل السلطان بالفسق. All Ahlul Sunnah have ijma' consensus that the Sultan is not to be removed or rebelled against if he was a fasiq, if he commits a sin or fisq. وأما الوجه المذكور في كتب الفقه, as for the other view that the people mentioned in their books of fiqh, لبعض أصحابنا أنه ينعزل, some people mentioned in the books of fiqh that the Sultan should be removed by fisq. Imam Nawawi says وحكي عن المعتزلة أيضا, even the Mu'tazila view this, that the Sultan has to be removed by fisq. Imam Nawawi says فغلط, all of this is wrong. So what has been in كتب الفقه, they mentioned the كتب الفقه, and regarding the Mu'tazila they said that the Sultan should be removed if he commits a sin. This is wrong. فغلط من قائله, it is wrong. مخالف للإجماع, against the consensus of Muslims. مخالف للإجماع. So you guys are done.
أيها الدواعش يا أسافلة الورى, يا عمي يا صم بلا آذان, أنا همكم أنا غمكم أنا سقمكم أنا سمكم في السر والإعلان.